His vow of purity had always been a quiet thing, a shield he carried against the loneliness of the open range. But as Jebediah Cain reined his horse, Promise, to a halt at the edge of the canyon, his vow became a screaming, terrible weight in his chest. Before him, two Apache sisters were huddled on the cracked earth. One lay dying. The other glared up at him, her beautiful face a mask of fierce, protective rage. He saw the desperation in her eyes, the tattered deerskin dress that had slipped from her shoulder, the glistening sweat on her skin. And he felt a visceral, shattering desire that went to war with his very soul. He swung down from his horse, offering a hand of help. The protective sister ignored it. Instead, she asked a question, her voice dangerously soft. "Your God teaches you to be pure, cowboy. Does he also teach you to be weak?" Jebediah's mouth went dry. The question landed like a physical blow, a calculated strike against the very bedrock of his faith. For a young man who had spent more time with Scripture than with people, the challenge was both a sacrilege and an undeniable truth. Weakness, his father had always told him, wasn't about the temptations you faced, but the duties you ran from. It was a piece of hard-earned wisdom from an older generation, one that valued resolve over righteousness. Jebediah's offered hand remained in the air, a symbol of a simple, good-hearted intention that felt utterly inadequate now. The protective sister's eyes were black and bottomless, holding a wisdom that seemed far older than her years. She was watching him, dissecting him, searching for the crack in his convictions. Her gaze was not that of a damsel in distress. It was the gaze of a commander assessing a potential weapon and finding it wanting. "They are coming," she said, the words stripped of all emotion. It wasn't a warning. It was a statement of inevitable physics, like saying the sun would set. "Who's coming?" Jebediah asked, his voice rough. He let his hand drop, the rejection stinging more than he cared to admit. He was used to being alone, but he wasn't used to being dismissed. She didn't answer. Instead, she shifted her body slightly, revealing more of the woman lying on the ground, her sister. The woman's skin was slick with fever, her breaths coming in shallow, ragged bursts. Her eyes were closed, her face a serene mask that belied the fire consuming her from within. Jebediah, who had seen his share of trail sickness and gunshot wounds, recognized the unmistakable signs of a body giving up. Without help, without shade and water, she would be gone before the moon was high. This was the validation of the stakes. This was not a game of words, but a race against death. She was bitten, the protective sister stated, her focus now entirely on the woman in her lap. She ran a hand over her sister's fevered brow, a gesture of profound tenderness that stood in contrast to her warrior's glare. A snake, 2 hours back, the poison is quick. Jebediah's heart hammered against his ribs. A snake bite! He knew the remedies, the desperate poultices, and the terrible work of the blade that might stop the venom's march. But all of that required a camp. It required time, and from the woman's unyielding tone, time is the one thing they did not have. His vow of purity suddenly felt like a distant, childish thing, a luxury he could no longer afford. The real world had found him, and it was demanding a toll in blood and choice. I can help," he stammered, taking a step forward. The protective sister's head snapped up. Help? The word was a venom of its own. She pushed back the tattered deerskin on her sister's limp leg, just above the ankle. There, on the smooth copper skin, were not the twin fang marks of a rattler. It was a brand. An intricate, stylized bee burned deep into the flesh, the skin around it raw and infected, the source of the fever. Jebediah stared, his blood running cold. That was no snake bite. That was the mark of a man. He had seen that brand once before on a stolen longhorn at the market in dusty Abilene.
It belonged to Bartholomew Corbin, a cattle baron who ruled his vast territory with an iron fist and a private army of cruel, efficient men. A man who considered everything and everyone on his land to be his property. The rumors about Corbin's vices, especially concerning native women, were whispered in saloons, stories of a cruelty that went beyond mere rustling. Corbin wasn't just a cattle king, he was a monster who collected beautiful things and broke them for his pleasure. The knowledge recontextualized everything. These women were not lost, they were escapees. They were property that had run away. And Corbin's men would not be hunters. They would be retrievers, with orders to bring back the stock, damaged or otherwise. He branded her like an animal, Jebediah whispered, the horror of it making his stomach churn. This went beyond temptation. This was an offense against God himself. His father's words echoed again, a moral compass spinning wildly in the chaos of his heart. Some things are so wrong, son, that standing by and doing nothing makes you a part of the crime.
"We need to move," he said, turning his attention to Sora. "I saw a small cave system in the rocks, 1/2 mile east. We can hide there, at least until nightfall. I can tend to her wound." His promise of community and mutual support resonated with a value deeper than his personal vows. He was in this moment part of their desperate tribe. Nita nodded, her expression shifting back to one of pure, pragmatic resolve. With a strength that surprised him, she began to lift her sister. Jebediah moved instinctively to help, his hands finding their way to Sora's back and legs. Her skin was impossibly hot, the fever radiating from her like a furnace. The deerskin of her dress was thin and worn, and he could feel the delicate shape of her body beneath it. It was an intimacy that was both chaste and overwhelmingly sensual. A test of his resolve more profound than any sermon. He grit his teeth, forcing the thoughts from his mind, focusing on the weight in his arms, the uneven ground beneath his feet. They moved in silence, a strange and desperate procession of 3 under the vast, indifferent sky. Jebediah led them into the labyrinth of red rock, the air growing cooler as they descended into the earth's embrace. The cave was small, barely more than a deep fissure, but it was concealed, a sanctuary carved by wind and time. As he lay Sora down gently on the cool stone floor, he heard it, a distant sound, almost lost in the wind, a horse's whinny, answered by another. Nita was already at the mouth of the cave, her body pressed flat against the rock, peering out. Jebediah joined her, his heart a cold knot in his stomach. Far below, at the canyon entrance where he had first seen them, 3 riders emerged. Even from this distance, their silhouettes were unmistakable. Corbin's men. Hard men, paid to be relentless. "They are faster than I thought," whispered Nita, her voice a thread of steel. Jebediah's mind raced. The cave was a good hiding place, but it was also a trap. There was no other way out. If found, they would be cornered animals. His simple plan, hide, heal, run, had just evaporated. 3 men. He had his rifle and his Colt. The odds were not impossible, but they were not good. A fight would be a death sentence, if not for him, then for the fever-racked girl on the cave floor. He looked at Nita, her profile etched against the golden light, her gaze fixed on the hunters below. Her fear was there, but it was buried deep beneath layers of pure, unyielding resolve. He saw now that her strength wasn't just a shield for her sister, it was a weapon for their survival. And he, the pure cowboy, was the only other weapon she had. He realized with a dawning, terrible clarity that saving them wouldn't be a simple act of charity.
It would require him to descend into a world of violence and deception he had spent his entire life trying to avoid. To protect them, he would have to become something other than pure. He would have to become cunning. He would have to become dangerous.
Back in the cool darkness of the cave, the world shrank to the size of a tomb. Outside, the sun beat down and death patrolled on horseback. Inside, the only sounds were Sora's labored breathing and the frantic pounding of Jebediah's own heart. Hiding was a coward's plan, a boy's plan. His father, a man who had faced Comanche war parties and unforgiving winters, had always taught him that survival was a verb, an act of relentless forward motion. You don't wait for the storm to pass, his voice echoed in Jebediah's memory, a piece of nostalgic wisdom from a simpler time. You find the weak spot in the wind and you push through it. Jebediah knew with a certainty that chilled him that this cave would become their grave if they waited for rescue. The validation of this truth was absolute. They had to act, not react. "He won't stop," Nita whispered from the cave's entrance, her voice flat. "Corbin, even if we get away from these three, he'll send 10 more. "Then we can't just run," Jebediah said, his mind working, the gears of strategy beginning to turn where only fear had been. The old Jebediah would have prayed for a miracle. This new one, forged in the crucible of the last hour, knew he had to engineer one himself. This second chance to define himself felt less like a gift and more like a terrifying burden. He moved to Sura's side, pulling a small leather pouch from his belt. He uncorked it, the sharp, clean scent of turpentine and herbs filling the small space. "This will fight the infection," he said quietly, his hands surprisingly steady as he began to clean the angry, swollen brand. It was an intimate act, a trespass on the sacred ground of her suffering. He focused on the task of healing, using the familiar ritual to ward off the paralyzing thoughts of Nita's stare and the hunters outside. He could feel her watching his every move, her silence a heavy cloak of judgment and reluctant dependence. He worked with a gentle efficiency that spoke of a life spent tending to hurts both animal and human, proving his value beyond just a gun. That he chose care over violence was a validation of his deeper character. Sura moaned, a soft, pathetic sound that twisted something deep inside Jebediah. Her fever was climbing. He glanced at Nita. "We don't have until nightfall. We have an hour, maybe 2. The ticking clock of Sura's life was the only thing that mattered, a primal focus that burned away all other distractions. Suddenly, a spray of pebbles skittered down the rocks just outside the cave mouth. Jebediah reacted without thinking. He lunged forward, grabbing Nita and pulling her away from the opening, clapping his hand over her mouth as he slammed her back against the cool rock wall. His body shielded hers, their chests pressed together, the heat of her skin a shocking contrast to the stone. He could feel the frantic, bird-like flutter of her heart against his own. Outside, the sound of a horse snorting, dangerously close. A man's voice, rough and impatient, floated in. "See anything?" "Nothing. Damned heat's playing tricks. Let's check the west ridge." The sound of hooves crunching on rock receded. Jebediah held his breath, counting to 60 before he dared to move. He slowly released his hand from Nita's mouth. Her eyes, inches from his, were wide and blazing. He was acutely aware of her body against his, of the torn dress at her shoulder, of the scent of her skin, dust, sweat, and something wild and sweet like desert sage after a rain.
The fire he'd been fighting flared into an inferno, a raw, urgent need that was terrifying in its intensity. She didn't pull away. She just watched him, her breathing evening out. In her gaze, he saw not fear, but a flicker of the same startling awareness. It was a moment of pure, undiluted connection, forged in shared terror and forbidden chemistry. And in that moment, Jebediah made his choice.
Sometimes a man's purity isn't lost in a moment of passion, but in a quiet decision to protect others. It's the choice to become what is necessary, even if it means sacrificing what you thought you were. It's in these moments we discover our true faith, not in the vows we make in the quiet of a church, but in the promises we keep in the chaos of a canyon. He finally stepped back, the spell broken. "They'll be back," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Heightened here is a death sentence." "We cannot outrun them," Nita stated, the cold reality returning. "Not with Sora." "We won't," Jebediah said, his eyes alight with a dangerous new spark. He grabbed a stick and began scratching in the dusty floor of the cave. "My horse, Promise, is hobbled a quarter-mile north of here. You two will take him and ride west, hard and fast. I'll stay here. I'll lead him south on foot, make him chase a ghost." It was a simple plan, a sacrificial plan, but it was all he had. Nita stared at the crude map, then at him. "They will kill you," he said. "They have to catch me first," with a confidence he didn't feel. He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and saw the deep lines of exhaustion around her eyes, the tremble she was trying to hide in her hands. She was a pillar of strength, but even pillars could crumble. His heart ached with a feeling so foreign and powerful it stole his breath, a fierce protective need to see her safe. It was a validation of his transformation. His vow had been about saving himself. This was about saving them. "Why?" Nita asked, the question so quiet he almost didn't hear it. "Because seeing that brand on your sister's skin made me realize that some sins can't be washed away by prayer alone. Because your defiance reminds me of what it means to truly fight for something. Because the thought of Corbin's men putting their hands on you makes me want to kill." He said none of these things. Instead, he simply said, "Because no one and no thing is property." It was the truest sermon he had ever preached. He helped them get Sora onto Promise's back, a slow and agonizing process. He gave Nita my rifle. "You know how to use this?" She took it with a familiarity that needed no answer. He gave her my last water skin and a small pouch of jerky. "Ride west until you hit the Green River. Follow it north. There's a small hidden mission there run by a man named Father Michael. Tell him Jebediah sent you. He's part of a community that still believes in sanctuary." She mounted the horse behind her sister, the rifle resting across her lap. For a moment, she just looked down at him, her expression a complex storm of doubt, gratitude, and something else he couldn't name. Then she leaned down, and before he could react, she pressed her lips to his cheek. It was a ghost of a touch, dry and fleeting, but it set his entire world on fire. "Be careful, pure cowboy," she whispered, and then she was gone, disappearing into the maze of rocks like a spirit of the canyon. Jebediah stood alone, the phantom touch burning on his skin. He took a deep breath,
The loneliness he had carried for years now replaced with a terrifying, exhilarating sense of purpose. He picked up 2 stones and began to walk south, striking them together in a steady, rhythmic pattern he'd learned as a boy to call stray cattle, a sound that was both common and distinct, a sound that would carry on the wind, a sound for hunters to follow. He was no longer the prey, he was the bait, and as he walked, he began leaving a trail, a scuffed print here, a broken branch there, a story written in the dust for Corbin's men to read. A story that would lead them as far away from Nita and Sora as he could manage. Each step was a prayer, each false sign a testament to his new fractured faith.
The chase was a brutal sermon on the nature of endurance. For 2 days, Jebediah led Corbin's men on a winding, fruitless dance through the harshest territory he could find. He became a ghost, a whisper in the canyons, his knowledge of the land his only shield. He moved by night, his body aching and fueled by nothing but cold fury and the lingering memory of a touch. During the day, he'd find a high perch to watch his pursuers, their frustration a tangible thing he could almost taste on the dry wind. He saw now what his father meant about hardship revealing a man's true nature. It wasn't just about survival, but about discovering the reserves of cunning you never knew you had. On the 3rd morning, exhaustion was a physical weight, a demanding creature gnawing at his bones. He doubled back during the night, a risky maneuver, hoping to lose them in a box canyon he knew had only one entrance. He found a small crevice in the rock face, a perfect sniper's nest, and settled in to wait. He wasn't just bait anymore. He was a hunter setting his own trap. He was no longer the boy who vowed purity, but the man who had chosen a side, validating the profound transformation that had taken place. An hour after sunrise, they appeared. 3 riders framed against the brilliant blue sky. They moved with a predator's arrogance, confident and cruel. Jebediah raised his Colt, the worn metal cool against his hand. He wasn't a killer. The thought was a cold knot in his stomach. His faith, his very soul, recoiled at the act. But the image of Neliliata's defiant face, of Sora's branded skin, burned hotter. This was no longer about his purity. This was about their justice. A clear moral choice, stark and unforgiving. He didn't aim at the men. He aimed at the rock wall just above their heads. The first shot cracked through the morning silence, a sound like the world splitting open. Rock chips exploded from the canyon wall. The lead horse screamed and reared, throwing its rider. The other 2 men scrambled for cover, pulling the rifles, their eyes scanning the rocks in a panicked frenzy. Jebediah fired again, this time at the scree slope to their left, triggering a small avalanche of pebbles and dust. He wasn't a killer. But he could be chaos. He could be fear. "He's up there," one of them yelled, firing blindly into the rocks. "Boxed us in like rats." Jebediah had their full attention. He'd bought all the time he could. Now, it was just about survival. He was reloading when a 4th shot echoed through the canyon, but it hadn't come from his gun. One of the men below crumpled to the ground, a dark stain blossoming on his chest. Jebediah stared, confused. Then he saw her, Neliliata, on a ridge opposite his own, lying flat on her belly, his rifle pressed to his shoulder. She had not run. She had come back. His heart seized, a painful mix of terror and a fierce, triumphant pride. She had made a choice, too. She had chosen to stand and fight beside him, forging a community of 2 against the world. The reciprocity, the fierce loyalty, was a bond stronger than any vow. It was the unspoken law of the frontier,
a community's sacred debt. Jebediah didn't know what to say. The boy in him was horrified by the violence, by the blood on his hands. But the man who stood before her felt a profound, unwavering rightness in what they had done. They had not been murderers. They had been dispensers of a justice the world was too corrupt to deliver. "What now?" he asked, the future a vast, terrifying, and unwritten territory. Nalilyato walked over to him. She reached out and gently took his Colt from his hand, placing it back in his holster. Then her hand came up to his cheek, the same spot where she had kissed him, her touch no longer a fleeting ghost, but a firm, grounding reality. "Now," she said, her dark eyes holding his, "you are no longer pure, Jebediah Cain. Now you are free." And in that moment, under the weight of her gaze, he understood. Purity had been his shield, but it had also been his cage, a set of rules to keep the chaos of the world at bay. He had been so focused on saving his own soul that he had forgotten how to live in the world. Nalyato, in her fierce and terrible beauty, had not just saved his life, she had given it back to him. The desire he felt for her was no longer a shameful secret to be fought, but a simple, profound truth. It was not a corruption of his faith, but an expansion of it. Love, he was beginning to understand, was its own form of righteousness. He placed his hand over hers on his cheek. "And you?" he asked quietly. "And you will do what?" A real smile touched her lips, reaching her eyes for the first time. "Sorrow will need time to heal. Father Michael's mission is a good place, a safe place." And she hesitated, her warrior's mask softening into a stunning vulnerability. "And a brave cowboy told me they still believe in sanctuary there. I think we will stay a while." Jebediah looked out at the vast, sun-drenched canyon, a landscape that had once been a symbol of his isolation, but now felt like the backdrop to his rebirth. The path ahead was uncertain. Corbin was still out there. The world was still a dangerous place, but for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid. He was not alone. He was standing beside a woman who had faced down monsters and won. He had lost his purity, but found his purpose. And he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his soul that his vow had not been broken. It had been transformed into something stronger, something truer, something worth fighting for. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect. Are our greatest strengths found in the vows we keep in times of peace, or in the convictions we discover in times of trial? If you believe in stories where courage is more important than purity, and where redemption is earned in the crucible of impossible choices, then like this video and subscribe to the channel. Join us here, where the tales of the Old West remind us not only of the men and women we were, but of the heroes we can still choose to be.